We are, right now, as I speak to you, as you listen to my voice, headed towards a full-blown constitutional crisis. That's the growing consensus among a number of extremely astute political observers who argue the political dysfunction that's brought about a shutdown and is now threatening default isn't some run-of-the-mill gridlock. It is exposing the fatal flaw in our Constitution and highly distinct system of government. In other words, it's the Constitution's fault, and something truly catastrophic was bound to happen sooner or later. Here's the argument in a nutshell. These kind of shutdowns, the one we're experiencing now, are almost impossible elsewhere in the world because of the European-style parliamentary system used by most democracies. Just about ensures the executive and legislature are controlled by the same groups of people. But thanks to the quirks of our U.S. Constitution, which makes it possible for different branches of government to be controlled by different parties, each party, during one of these standoffs we're seeing right now, can plausibly claim that they're the ones that represent the will of the people. Now, the founders did this with the hope of restraining government, with checks and balances. And in the past, because of the unique nature of American political parties, which were stitched together from a bunch of different regional interests, not particularly ideologically coherent, divided government has led to some big compromises. Under President Eisenhower and a Democratic-controlled Senate, we got the Civil Rights Act in 1957 and 1960. And in 1981, with the help of Southern Democrats in the House of Representatives, President Reagan passed his enormous tax cuts. But that's not what we have anymore. What we have now is record polarization. And one party, the GOP, that is likely the most extreme, ideologically coherent, and demographically self-contained party probably ever in American history. They believe that despite losing the presidential election, being a minority in the Senate, and receiving less votes in the House, they have full democratic legitimacy. They're willing to do whatever it takes, no matter how unprecedented or destructive, to impose their will. Writer Jonathan Chait calls what is shaping up a domestic Cuban Missile Crisis, where a single blunder could have unalterable consequences. The question is, can our constitutional system function with the modern GOP? Joining me now is Jonathan Chait, columnist for New York Magazine. And Jonathan, your piece has thousands of likes on Facebook. It's an incredibly arresting thesis. Walk me through the basic idea. We've got the constitutional system that we have and the modern political party system, and you seem to be saying these two are on a collision course.
That's right. Now, look, it's not all the constitutional system, right? Because the debt ceiling is the most explosive part of the current showdown, and the debt ceiling has nothing to do with the American system per se. We could just get rid of the debt ceiling and have our elections and the rest of our Constitution carry on as it always has. But you do have a lot of factors coming together. And like several other writers, I described the political scientist Juan Linz, who talked about the dangers of having a system where you have opposing parties trying to share power, because you can't always decide through laws who gets to have the power.
There's a great Linz quote, and people should be aware, and I think a lot of people probably don't know this, that our system, what's called a presidential system, where you've got the executive, one party legislature probably by another, that's rare. That's an anomaly across the world. And Linz says the problem when you have one of these standoffs, like the standoff we have at this very moment, is there is no democratic principle on the basis of which it can be resolved. The mechanisms a constitution might provide are likely to prove too complicated and aridly legalistic to be of much force in the eyes of the electorate. In other words, what's the game plan out of the shutdown? What's the game plan out of the debt ceiling? There is no game plan, right?
There's no game plan. There's no rules. It's really a contest of willpower, and that's a really dangerous system for any democracy to have. You want to have rules to decide how do you resolve this conflict. Because if you can't resolve reopening the government at some point, you have a serious problem. And if you can't resolve the debt ceiling before the X date, then you've got a severe problem, a total crisis. And we've got no playbook. It's just a matter of which side really wants it more, is more willing to endure the political pain.
And that gets us to the nature of modern parties. I want to bring in Congressman Jerry Nadler, Democrat from New York, who wrote for the Huffington Post a piece about this being essentially democracy at issue here. And there's a fascinating bit of data I want to show you. This is essentially about the overlap between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican, which for decades there was a whole area in the middle where you had overlap between the people that were you know, the most conservative Democrats and the most liberal Republicans, and there was overlap and overlap and overlap. And as we've gone through time, that overlap has completely evaporated. Congressman.
Well, that is true, and that makes making compromises much harder. But that's not the fundamental issue here. The fundamental issue here is that the Republicans are doing what no one has done since arguably before the Civil War, and that is trying to use a minority control of one house, or even a minority in one house leveraging control of that house to thwart the will of the majority. I mean, the Obamacare bill was passed, the Affordable Care Act bill was passed by the Senate, by the House, by a majority of Congress, signed by the President, okayed by the Supreme Court. It was one of the issues in the election in which the Democratic Senate and the President were reelected. If you want to repeal it, and again, without regard to the merits of it, if you want to repeal it, make that case to the American people, get a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and the President. Right, but don't blackmail the country by saying, we'll destroy the economy if you don't go along with us.
Well, this gets back to this rules question that Jonathan and I were just talking about, which is they're not doing anything that violates the Constitution. I mean, they are essentially attempting to maximize their leverage. They're reacting in a rational way given the constraints.
They're not violating the Constitution, but they're violating democratic norms. Right. The norms upon which this government, the operations of our democracy depends. And that norm is you allow the majority to rule. And if you think the majority is wrong, you try to convince the American people of that.
Now what we have is an insurrectionist neo-Confederate party that it seems to be dedicated to all kinds of apocalyptic outcomes. I don't know whether this comes from their fundamentalist religious outlook or whether it's just good fundraising for them among their base, but they are no longer a normal political party.
That is Mike Lofgren, who spent decades on Capitol Hill as a staffer in the Senate and House for Republicans, talking about the modern incarnation of the Republican Party. I'm back with Jonathan Chait and Congressman Jerry Nadler. And joining us is Heidi Moore, U.S. Finance and Economics Editor for The Guardian. And Heidi, we've been talking about this moment as constitutional crisis. We've been talking about it as a crisis for democracy, in which a party that is essentially a minority party is attempting to use their leverage to rule from the minority. And you think this is nothing as apocalyptic as that. This is just basically the run-of-the-mill gridlock that you get.
Yes, this is crazy pants, but it's the kind of crazy pants and the kind of insanity that our country was designed to invite. I mean, we really don't have a minority running Congress. You don't have even a minority running the House right now. They just seem to have the upper hand temporarily, but nothing's been decided. And I think the question that a lot of people in America have is, why bring the Constitution into it? Why is this just not people who can't do their jobs?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Jonathan.
With all due respect,
Congressman, please.
Okay. With all due respect, that's simply wrong. It is unprecedented. You don't see the Democrats in the Senate saying, we'll cause a default on the debt and we'll destroy the economy unless you give us a strong immigration bill or a strong gun control bill or the union recognition bill that we wanted. It took 60 years to get any kind of national health insurance till even though we had Democratic presidents and Congresses before, because you had to assemble a majority in all three branches at one time. What's making this unusual, unprecedented, is that the Republicans in the House are threatening not to negotiate, but they're threatening default. They're threatening catastrophe. It's like a 1930s gangster film, as I wrote, saying, in which somebody says, it's a nice economy you got there. Pity if it should happen to blow up if you don't pay me off.
Congressman, I want to distinguish a few things here. And Jonathan, I want to come to you on the Constitution question. But Heidi first, right? There's a few things I think to distinguish what's making up this crisis, right? Why it feels bigger than previous. And one is the stakes of the debt ceiling, right? One is the idea this is happening not after an election the Republicans just won, as in 2011, in which arguably they just taken back the House, they had some sort of mandate, but in one they just lost, right?
Yeah.
Do you think essentially that all of this hyperbole, as you see it, about the debt ceiling is essentially posturing that's going to go away when a deal gets struck?
Well, I think something needs to happen for a deal to get struck. You need an intermediary. I mean, in the world of business, it's just like a union standoff. It's just like a strike. And so somebody has to come in and solve the strike. But yes, I do believe that it will be solved. It's almost beyond comprehension to believe that anyone who serves the United States of America would willingly allow it to default on its debt, even if they say so.
Right. Okay. The reason I got very excited about that, Jonathan, is that I would have said the same thing a month ago. I really would have. I would have said this is posturing because I didn't think they were going to shut it down, because shutting it down was something that basically the majority of the House caucus didn't want. The Wall Street Journal editorial page and Karl Rove and Krauthammer and essentially the entire Republican establishment, and yet here we are in a shutdown. Jonathan, that suggests to me that it does not mean that logic, common sense prevails over the party at this point.
That's absolutely right. There's a couple of things that are concerned here. First of all, does Boehner really want to do the right thing? He may come to a moment where he has to choose between saving the country and saving his job, and what will he choose? Second of all, even if he tries to do the right thing, we've seen multiple times in which he can't do the right thing, in which he bungles the vote count. Something goes wrong. And that's the problem with having this incredibly high-stakes vote tied to these fraught political negotiations, because if something goes wrong even by accident, let alone a bad faith attempt by one of the parties to extort concessions, you can have utter disaster.
Congressman, when you say that this is unprecedented, how do you understand the rupture that's happened? Which, you see what I'm saying? Like, at what point did the GOP convert over from something that was normal to something that was abnormal, something that was precedented?
I think it's been developing for a while. Norm Ornstein and Mann in their books say that the Republicans have become an outliner, an insurgent, not a real political party anymore. And I think, I don't know exactly when, but when they determined that stopping Obamacare or any particular goal became important enough to threaten the economy, to take hostages, to take the government and the country hostage, that's when the point was reached. And it was certainly reached when they threatened, when they used the debt ceiling for that purpose 2 years ago. And the president, unfortunately, negotiated with them and gave us a sequester. He can't do that again, because that'll be the end of Democratic government.
End of Democratic governance. And Heidi, you cover financial markets. And one of the things I think has been interesting is we saw a lot of turmoil in financial markets around the 2011 almost default. Financial markets seem relatively calm, cutting against the Jonathan Chait thesis of the Congressman Nadler thesis, or even my belief that we're heading towards something extraordinary and apocalyptic. Financial markets seem relatively sanguine right now.
Yeah, it's the Congress who cried wolf, right? We've seen this before, and everyone in the market reacted before and knows that there's no use to doing it now. They know that a last-minute solution is not only a possibility, but it's exactly what happened last time.
I will say this. I hope the markets are right. Jonathan Chait from New York Magazine.
The markets are wrong all the time.
Yes, they are. I said hope, not expect.